Hello there. My name is Kat Buxton, and I'm from Sharon, Vermont. I'm a consultant about food and soil and bugs and plants and compost. And I work with the Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition and several other groups to try and spread the word about the significance of soil health and the agency that we actually have over the health of our soil based on our management practices. So we're going to be talking about the soil health principles today for the NOFA Vermont Farm Beginnings program. And the big question is, can we build soil faster than it's leaving us with our intense rains? We really do owe our existence to the very thin layer of topsoil on this beautiful planet that we're able to build our livelihoods from, and is able to capture the rain, which we're finding in increasing amounts in the Northeast. This picture is from Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, showing an overhead view of all of the farm soil and dirt roads that drained into the Connecticut River and down into Long Island Sound. Really stunning effect on our region. We're still recovering in many places from this storm, even though we've had several more damaging storms and flooding afterwards. It's costing us a lot of money, and it's also costing our soil, which we all work so hard to build. This particular map is showing that Vermont has had a lot of federally declared disasters. And this is just showing projects up until 2013, showing basically the whole state is dealing with increased rainfall, flooding, and the impacts of such. So nobody's being left out of this, and we know that we're going to keep getting more of these rains. These are some photos just from July 2019, when we had a regular rainstorm that actually caused significant damage in many of our towns, to roadways and to farms. And then this past summer in July, we had record-breaking flooding statewide that cost a lot of farms their crops right in the height of our season. There's not a whole lot we can do about rivers rising in terms of soil health, but we can increase the amount of moisture that our soil can hold in rainstorms, and we can try and shore up our soil with living roots so that it's less likely to wash away in intense rains. This is from the University of Vermont Climate Program and U.S. Global Change Research Program. This is showing the observed change in heavy precipitation, very heavy precipitation across the United States. And just notice that dark blue, 71% increase in our region. We're seeing that, and we can expect this to continue. The soil health principles were designed by the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, a branch of the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA. And as shown on this screen, the context isn't really included in that, but we're going to go over it. The NRCS really focuses on principles 2, 3, 4, and 5. We sometimes talk about 6 as well, and we're going to go through these in this presentation. The first principle, I think, is really important, and that is context. And that's coming from people who are employing these principles in their landscapes all around the world, are really bringing forward that the context that you're working in is the most important thing to consider before you start thinking about how to build the soil sponge and what management practices to employ to try and enable your sponge to grow. So thinking about where you are in the world, here we are in the Northeast. We've just talked about how we're going to have increased rains coming our way. Thinking about Vermont in our past, we were a sheep farming state, and before that, it was a whole lot of trees. So all of this helps to inform the biological and geological components in our soil. Those are really important considerations when thinking about your context, as is the physical layout of your land. What's the topography like? Are you on a slope? Are you flat? Do you have bedrock underneath you? Which way does the wind come from, and where does the sun shine? What kind of soil type do you have, and what are the parent minerals? What kind of weather patterns might you be expecting? And we did talk a bit about increased precipitation in our region, but we also know that we're going to have longer periods of no rain in between times of getting way too much rain at one time. So these are all parts of the context that we want to be thinking about. How has the land been used over time, and by whom? Who was managing the land before you? What were the practices that they were using? What can you learn from their successes or failures, or just the changes over time that they were able to observe? How is the land being used now, and where do you want to go with it? What are you managing for? Are you growing grass for your animals? Are you growing row crop vegetables, fruits and nuts, flowers, etc.? These are all really important when we think about what sorts of attributes we want to encourage in our soil ecosystems. And what are the limitations that you're working within? If you're in a completely shaded area and you're trying to grow tomatoes, that's definitely going to impact your future. If you're on a slope and you want to grow something that requires tillage, that's likely going to increase your potential for erosion. What other resource concerns are there? And that's a term that's used by the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, to identify problem areas or things that we want to protect, or maybe they aren't being protected. And that's a really key term for funding with the NRCS, is being able to identify your resource concerns. Do you have access to tools? Do you have access to the land? Do you have access year round? Do you have the money? Do you have the human power to get it done? So really be thinking about those limitations when you're thinking about the context of your landscape and the context of your business, and what you plan to be able to do is certainly going to be impacted by how the land has been managed in the past. The second principle is the concept of having living roots in the ground for as long as possible. So living roots in the ground with green growing plants on top seasonally. Of course, in winter, we don't have a whole lot of green growing plants on top unless you're in the Christmas tree business, and then you might have photosynthesis while at a slower rate still happening in the wintertime. Photosynthesis is driving the cycle of life and the sequestration of carbon. The cycling of carbon would be the better thing to say, transferring carbon from plants into root systems to get the sugars down into the soil to help feed those microorganisms. So the longer you can have living roots in the ground, the longer you are actually feeding the biology in the soil. In addition, those roots are helping to hold your soil in place. And when looking at this slide, I always like to point out the depth of the roots. Certainly, if you have bedrock in your soil, that's going to make the roots take a hard right or a hard left. But if you don't have bedrock, you can actually get your root system pretty deep if you provide the context for them to grow. The other thing I'd like to point out on this slide is all the way to the left side of the slide, there's a tiny little green plant with tiny little roots underneath it, and that is your standard lawn. These little white balls on this root system are fixed nitrogen nodules. So this is one way that plants are able to partner with microorganisms in the soil to fix nitrogen gas into a usable form for plants, which is one reason that growing legumes, which are, all the beans, alfalfa, nuts, many plants have leguminous, are in the leguminous family, and are able to fix nitrogen. One thing I like to point out with this picture is that you can see that there are soil aggregates beginning to form, which are those little clumps of soil. We're going to talk more about that. But this plant was pulled out of a pretty regularly disturbed garden space. So it's not a place where the microbes have been able to work in concert undisturbed for a long time, which is why you're seeing a lot of clean roots there. So dirty roots are an indicator of good soil glues and an indicator that you've got soil health happening, as are these nitrogen nodules, an indicator that you've got the right microbes in your soil to be able to conduct the nitrogen cycle and make that available for your plants. This slide is showing the rhizosphere, which is highlighted in the blue area. Imagine that brown root in the center is actually quite small, and the blue area around it, the area around the root, is called rhizosphere. So rhizo is root and sphere is the area around it. To the right and left, you see white lines coming in. Those are representing the hyphae of fungal organisms that are actually increasing the area from which the plant is able to communicate with microorganisms and be able to uptake nutrients. Those little red bits are indicating biology in the soil. So bacteria, nematodes, protozoa, etc. When those organisms, and especially the higher organisms, are able to eat and poop within the rhizosphere, all of those nutrients that were taken in by the microbes become available to the plant. So increasing the area of the rhizosphere in your soil is really critical for nutrient uptake. And the way to do that is to have as many living roots in the ground for as long as possible. Mycorrhizal fungus is something we hear a lot about, and it's really what enables trees to talk to one another. This image is showing a baby pine sapling, which is the brown part of that root structure, and almost all of the white that you see there is the mycorrhizal fungus colonizing that root system and expanding the area that that plant has access to in the soil. We have a lot to learn about soil organisms. And the more we learn, the more we realize that creating the conditions for them is really critical, bringing us into the third principle of maximizing diversity. So diversity is all of your plants above the ground. It's all of the critters underneath the ground. It's your critters above the ground as well. We're starting to learn a little bit about something called quorum sensing. Highly recommend looking that up. Dr. Christine Jones out of New Zealand has done a lot of work on that theory, and basically telling us that at some point we reach a level of diversity, over a dozen different species working together are able to cycle more nutrients through the ability to attract a larger range of diversity of microorganisms, each of which has their own specialized performance that they can do in the soil. So looking for different nutrients, partnering with different plants, and generally increasing the entire nutrient uptake capacity of the soil. This is the soil food web. We won't spend a lot of time here, but just notice that there are different levels of the organisms, and it's important to have all of these levels functioning. You can get really detailed and get a microscope and start counting and identifying, or you can follow the principles of increasing diversity in every way that you can and trusting that diversity begets diversity begets diversity. When we have all of these trophic levels in the soil, what's happening is we have all the predator-prey relationships necessary in a web to be able to cycle the nutrients through living systems. Choosing the right plants to increase beneficial insect populations can be really helpful too. So if you're a row crop farmer and you don't have a lot of room for diversity within your row crops, You could be thinking about diversity at the end of your rows or between your rows or in your pollinator gardens nearby, and really trying to choose species that are highly diverse in timing, in flower, in structure, in root structure, and plant structure, in habit and habitat needs, and focusing on plants that are already that have already established relationships with native pollinators. The Xerces Society and many others are able to provide really good lists of these plants, and thinking about also including as many of those species as you can. So you're looking for diversity in species, in structures, and in the numbers of organisms as well. Polyculture is a term that you may have heard. If you haven't, look it up. It's really popular in the permaculture world. And it's essentially just saying, some plants really can play very well together. This idea of competition is not as true as we think it is. When we look at nature, in natural settings, there's a lot of diversity and everybody's working really well together. When we get into systems where we're trying to manage who grows where, then we start really disrupting some of those diverse and complicated relationships. Um, so try to find things that can partner really well with your featured crops, and then you can begin to enhance diversity in all of the places. Thinking in layers is another way to be thinking about diversity. This is more from the permaculture world. So, you've got your layers underneath the soil, and then all of your layers reaching up through the horizons of the soil and into your low-growing plants, into your herbaceous annuals and perennials, all the way into shrubs, and then small trees and large trees, and getting up to the canopy. So as many layers as you can provide in your system is also going to be helpful. This is one reason that agroforestry is being considered a good move in terms of being able to be resilient to the incoming climate changes. It increases root depth and canopy height, potentially increasing all of the layers in between. The fourth principle is minimizing disturbance. So disturbance is everything from all the different kinds of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, miticides, and also farm equipment, everything from a shovel to a subsoiler, and everything in between. Every time we touch the soil with our tools or with chemicals, we disturb it. Does that mean we shouldn't disturb the soil? No, it just means that we should be aware of how and how often we're disturbing the soil, because every time we do, we are disrupting the hopeful massive diversity underneath the soil. It takes quite a while for organisms to be able to reorganize and reestablish themselves. But with the right conditions, it can happen more quickly than, I should say that it can happen pretty quickly, depending on a lot of different things. But it's certainly not the 100 years that they would tell us that it takes an inch of soil to create. That's from a geological perspective only. So when we bring in the biological piece, we can actually make a pretty big difference in 1, 2, and 3 seasons. And the longer that we're able to employ these principles, the better. There are other kinds of disturbance as well, and some of that has to do with intense rains. When we get flooding, that is a disturbance. There's not a whole lot we can do, as I said earlier, to prevent the rivers from rising, at least not from the perspective of our farms and our gardens. We can't change the impacts of volcanoes, landslides, etc. So there are some kinds of disturbance that all we can do is react to, but there are other kinds of disturbance that we can prevent, and being aware of that is important. Minimizing bare soil is a really critical principle. On the top left here, you're looking at the little cartoon picture. It's basically a replica of what's happening in the picture from Karoo, South Africa below. And that picture is from the archives of Alan Savory. I recommend looking him up if you are someone who grazes animals. He talks a lot about holistic grazing management and has developed some really amazing protocols for you to be able to look at. On that picture on the bottom, what's happening there is the landscape was like it was on the right side of the fence for a long, long time. And because of the management style. So what you're looking at are two different management styles. Same soil type, same weather patterns, same animals even grazing on top. On the left side, they employed holistic grazing management, essentially replicating what the large herds were able to do before we killed them all off. So high stocking rate density, lots of animals in a small area, moving through quickly, eating, pooping, making some disturbance with their hooves. And that kind of disturbance is actually really important because it's changing the soil surface so that water can interface in a different way. It can infiltrate more. It's turning up more seeds. And within a short time, a couple of years of this kind of practice, you can go from a deserted landscape into one that is fully covered. When we think about how carbon and water interact with the landscape on the left and how it interacts with the landscape on the right, it's pretty clear it's quite different. Think also about the temperature that it would feel on the bottom of your feet or on the bottom of your livestock's feet on the left side versus the right side. So the left side is really what we want to be moving toward, minimizing that bare soil, bringing it back to the first principle of living roots and the ground. These two are very connected. When we have bare soil, our carbon and our water leave pretty quickly. When we have covered soil, we're able to cycle and hang on to those for a bit longer. Some examples of soil cover. Again, your context is going to make a really big difference in what kind of soil cover you can be thinking about. You could be doing green manure. You could be doing alley cropping like you see on the top left. Cover cropping on a corn-on-corn rotation can make a pretty big difference in the amount of erosion and soil loss leaving the field and going into our waterways. So lots of ways to be thinking about minimizing disturbance and keeping the soil covered. Management really does matter. This is a rainfall simulator that we are looking at, a pretty popular tool with the NRCS, and we're seeing lots of sort of homemade versions of these popping up in educator circles. Essentially, the 5 cookie cutter bits on top are the same soil composition, the same place. The only thing that's different is the management of that soil on top. So on the left side, the one with all the plants in it is presumably, I don't actually know, but presumably that is a perennial pasture. And all the way to the right side would be a tilled bare soil. And in between are in between. What you should be looking at are the back row jars and the front row jars. The back row jars is showing the infiltration of rainwater, and the front row is showing the runoff of rainwater. So you set these up. There's some protocols to make sure that you're getting the cookie cutter portions similar in volume, and also making sure that there's not a lot of airspace around them to affect the way that the water moves. And then you run a shower head over top of them, simulating a 2-inch or 4-inch rainstorm, whatever you want to do. And then you're looking at how much of that water is infiltrating into the back jar and how much of it is running off. And I hope you've already noticed that underneath the grass on the left side, there is no runoff, and the water that infiltrated in the back row jar is clear. And conversely, on the right side of the screen, the back row jar is empty, so no water infiltrated into the soil, and a lot, in fact, all of it ran off the front and took soil with it. So this is just one really powerful tool showing how management can matter and following the soil health principles can make a really big difference. The sixth principle is animals in contact with soil. And this is a time to say that, nature never farms without animals. Whether you're talking about the massive diversity in the soil of soil critters, or it's buffalo and wildebeest, or it's sheep and cows, or it's grasshoppers and elephants. If they eat and they poop, those are animals in contact with the soil. When it comes to livestock, thinking again about that picture of the fence line with the holistic grazing management on one side and random grazing on the other side, you can really impact the health of a soil by mimicking the way that the herds used to move. So holistic grazing management is about getting the livestock back outside on grass, adjusting the herd size to actually increase the density of animals and move them often. And the timing is dependent on a lot of different things, including the seasonality, the health of the field, the health of the animals, and more. Animals in contact with soil. The way you graze definitely matters. I really like this slide, it's from Dr. Christine Jones, who's the same one that I recommended talking about quorum sensing. To listen to her work. So just this is showing us that when animals are on pasture for a long time, they will eat down to the nub. So looking at the right side, and when they eat that much of the grass, it takes the grass a lot longer to recover. When you're increasing the stocking density and you're moving animals quickly before they can eat down to the nub, but maybe about 50%, depending on how high the grass was when you started, you want to leave a good 10 inches so that all of the soil health principles are still in play. You've still got photosynthesis. And this study is showing us that when we only use 50% of that top mass, or we're leaving that good 10 inches or so above the soil, the roots underneath actually don't stop growing. They continuously grow. So you're not setting the pasture or the environment back through taking too much. The seventh principle, we like to call this one just water, slow, spread, and sink the rainwater. If you follow all of the soil health principles, this will happen. But really putting a focus on water is critical, especially given that we are in a time where we're getting a lot more rain, both at once and more often. So learning to manage that water in as many creative ways as we can is critical, not only to keep our crops hydrated during times of drought, but to prevent the loss of our soil into waterways. And on the bottom right, that picture with the red blobs on it is showing ocean dead zones. So when we lose our soil, and if there are all sorts of chemical pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, anhydrous ammonia, et cetera, in that waterway, those are going right down into the ocean and expanding these ocean dead zones, which have been growing every year that we've all been alive. So when thinking about these soil health principles, we really want to be able to think about how can we support the land to enable conditions for thriving biodiverse ecosystems that benefit all of us. So supporting the land, and that's the job of a land manager, whether you're owning the land, working the land, visiting the land, really understanding that we have a role to enable conditions and certainly not to create barriers for those conditions to thrive. Thinking about the outcomes that we're looking for are important, and also the outcomes that happen based on our management. The picture in the center with the sort of flower petals, you can't really read those, but the so-called ecosystem services or the functions that ecosystems provide, there's a short list on the right side listed as outcomes from healthy ecosystems. And getting back to that picture, the natural ecosystem on the left-hand side, nature provides us with everything that we need, everything that everyone needs, all critters, with the exception of crop production. In the center, that's kind of what we do. Humans come in and are like, well, we know how to fix this. We're going to focus solely on crop production at the expense of all other services that ecosystems provide us. And what I'd like to invite, and what many are inviting, is can we move toward this cropland restored ecosystem services? So can we grow the food that we need while not destroying the ecosystem services that are being provided to all other living beings? And traditional ecological knowledge has held this for a very long time. We have a lot to learn, and many people that are with us that we can learn from. When we don't think about the connectivity of the ecosystem, we end up with lots of bad impacts, which are highlighted in pink down there on the bottom of the slide. Using the soil health principles, observe change over time, establish a baseline, track alongside your management practices. Some of the tools that you can use are observation hoops, infiltration rings, visual soil assessments. Many of these tools are available for very inexpensive, or you can make your own. Just digging a hole can be really helpful in understanding what's happening underneath the ground. If you want to observe changes over time, it is important to choose an area, set up a transect, so that you can find that area again and test the same area to really be able to track the changes over time. And a transect is helpful because if you dig a hole, you've now disturbed that soil. So the next time you go back to it, it's obviously going to be different based on the fact that you dug a hole. But if you have, say, a 16 square foot area in your field that you can move a foot or two every couple of years when you dig a hole, you can begin to track the management over time and how that's affecting the landscape without causing continual disturbance. Another really simple tool is the aggregate stability test. I sent along some resources for y'all to be able to check out some videos from Ray Archuleta, who's one of my heroes, showing the aggregate stability test. Super easy to do. You don't need fancy equipment. Just upcycled plastic water bottles are helpful. Make sure they're clear. Straight walled is helpful. Ball jars also work. Any fencing or an onion bag or something like that on top can be really helpful. So read the instructions for how to do that. And what we're looking at here, the clear jar is showing that we have aggregates that are stable. So those clumps of soil along root systems that are held together by the goos, glues, snots, and slimes produced by the billions of microorganisms that we have enabled the conditions for in our soil. If you grow it, they will come. So follow those soil health principles. Many living roots in the ground, as many with green growing plants on top for as long as possible, maximized in diversity of species and volume above and below the ground, minimizing the disturbances that we have control over and preparing for those that we don't, minimizing bare soil whenever possible. Using mulch is something I didn't mention, but if you're a row crop farmer, you must know about that. Integrating animals whenever you can, and slowing, spreading, and sinking the rainwater. Hope that's helpful, and I look forward to chatting with you. Recording.